Well, good morning. It's morning, unfortunately, because last night was a bit of a Brisbane drama, and you can see I'm dressed casually today as a consequence. So we had a major hailstorm last night, and that meant I couldn't iron any clothes today. I don't prepare ahead like a very bad student. I should always prepare ahead for these things, but yeah, quite an exciting event. I didn't get away from the uni until around 9 o'clock last night because of all the trains and buses were clogged or closed. But anyway, this week we've got decision making and creativity, kind of fun topics, but not as onerous to get through, so we should have a nice half-hour video hopefully by the end of it. That previous slide was just for the internal students, not for you guys. So I'll be talking a little bit about rational choice paradigm, which is kind of the ideal way to think about decision making, and the real ways to think about decision making, as opposed to, you know, in dreamland how it actually works in reality. And we'll talk about employee involvement using a particularly current case as an example, and have a look at creativity, which is kind of fun. So first of all, decision making, a bit of a definition for you, and the rational choice paradigm, which is this theoretical process of choosing the best possible alternative based on all the information that you make, and then choosing between the different options, using what's called subjective expected utility, which we'll talk about, and going through it in a very systematic, logical way. Subjective expected utility, a bit of a tongue twister there. But basically, subjective expected utility is where you analyse different options, A, B and C, as in the diagram here, and you extrapolate into the future about the expected value or utility. Happiness is this, as I point out there, you know, the positive benefits of a particular outcome. But it's all based upon subjective calculations, not just of how much you will value something in the future. And we're very poor at calculating the future, and also how we'll feel about the future. I've had some cases recently where friends of mine have split up with their partners, for example, and thinking that they'd be fine, and then discovered afterwards that they're absolutely devastated, even though they were the ones that chose to split up. They hadn't projected themselves successfully into the future. So this element here of your mind is a dodgy and subjective element that does muddy up the whole process of decision making. The rational choice model, just briefly, it starts off with you identifying a basic problem, and then you need to establish criteria about, you know, success and failure, what you'll consider to be success, and this kind of 10% profit margin, on the other hand, losing some close supply allies as a result of increasing profitability. You have to generate these alternatives and evaluate them, choose the best one based on this information that you have. Then you implement the decision, and then hopefully you come back to it and check whether the decision was successful in the ideal world. So this is based upon a lot of unknowns, and this is the main problem with the rational choice decision modelling. It assumes, first of all, that we do not bring emotions into the equation, and secondly, it also assumes that we have great big brains with access to a lot of information, godlike, and when the reality of the situation is that our brains do have very distinct limits, and we do have emotions which do apply themselves to how we make decisions. Yeah, the problems themselves are not entirely clear in the real world. They are maybe in mathematics, but in real business decision making, it's very muddy, it's very crowded with information, conflicting evidence, and we do not have, but our preferences may change from moment to moment. As I say, with the case of my friends who split up with their partners, beforehand it seems like this, afterwards it suddenly seems like financial security might be more important. There are time and cost constraints on decisions, on the time you have to make decisions, and there are questions about what will produce the maximum payoff for you. The term that's used is bounded rationality, and what that means is, like I've indicated visually with these two lines, is that there's a limit to which we can apply rational choice to real-world decision-making. A long way of saying something that's fairly obvious when you think about it. I think I'll move on from that not particularly useful video. So in order to improve decision making, we're going to be talking a little bit about intuition and the dangers of the group. I'll just and we will be talking about perceptual limitations. I'm just going through this quickly, looking to see what I'm going to touch on in a little bit later, but I'll just talk briefly about the issue of the group and the example that I used in class yesterday when the hailstones started falling on Brisbane was the case of the Bay of Pigs and President Kennedy. This is probably well before most of your times, in fact before mine, it was before I was born. But President Kennedy, JFK, is very famous, but he almost became known not for being assassinated, but for a catastrophic series of events that led to a bit of an American humiliation in Cuba. They attacked the Bay of Pigs, which was an American satellite, I think, in Cuba, an area of Cuba that was owned by America. The decision that was made to launch military action there proved to be catastrophic, and books have been written about what happened in the cabinet room in the White House. How did they make such stupid mistakes? And if you ever get a chance to read this case study, it makes fascinating reading, and it talks about the dangers of the group and groupthink in decision making. If you have a strong leader, and we all love them, very quickly people can latch on to the strong leader, and before you know it, you have a coalition, and that coalition forms, coalesces, and hardens, and it's very hard for anyone to pipe up and say, hey, just a moment, I've got concerns about this. And that's indeed what happened in that particularly famous case. The rational model, probably without hammering on too much about it, but it assumes all sorts of things that are not the case in the real world. I've just listed a few of them there. The evidence from the fleshy, bloody world of organisational behaviour is that things aren't quite what we hope they would be. So goals are ambiguous, and some people want this and some want that. Even within ourselves, they're disputed. We have conflicting ideas and conflicting priorities. We certainly have limited processing power, and that processing power can be damaged further by the fact if you're stressed, you're tired, you're hungry, for example. Well, look, we also make the mistake of evaluating alternatives not in parallel. So if we've got A, B, and C as alternative outcomes or things to decide about, we tend to have a look at A, and if we like it enough, we don't give proper weight to the possibility of B and C in the first place. We often latch onto a good enough option, and when we've got a menu of different options. I mean, I've got this major problem when I go to a restaurant, that because I was brought up to eat whatever was on my plate, when I go to a restaurant, my instinct is to eat whatever is the first item on the menu that my eye goes to. And subsequently I may miss out on particularly good other options on the menu. I think that's a particularly good example of how the brain actually works, as opposed to how a rational decision-making model would assume that it works. I want to talk about some of the biases that affect decision-making. Prospect theory of Kahneman and Tversky, basically, it's worth a read, but in essence, a chance, if you cast a decision as being a chance of a loss, as opposed to an equivalent chance, the flip side, of a success, we react much more negatively to chance of loss than we do to chance of success. So we overweight losing from a current position. Kahneman, Tversky, and prospect theory, this is a particularly interesting and influential problem. And one of the great things about their research is it's shown that even statistically and logically and IQ sophisticated people with great brains, still suffer from this kind of bias. And in fact, a number of these biases. Overconfidence bias is another one that, intelligent people still, we tend to overrate our chances of getting questions right. If we are 100% certain that we know an answer to a quiz question, for example, the reality is it's probably closer to 70 or 50%, even when we really do have very high degree of what we call meta-knowledge. Randomness errors, even highly statistically sophisticated people do not understand randomness. They understand it maybe in theory, but they do not respond to randomness properly when it comes to gambling, games of chance as opposed to skill. We still misunderstand risk. Representative heuristic and availability heuristic, they're worth having a read about too, but they're often very much influenced by the media, for example. So availability heuristic, just to give you an idea, associated with, if you watch the weather, for example, you'll notice that they only talk about extreme events. And not surprisingly, we think, well, the amount of extreme events happening around the world is increasing, for example. And probably with climate change, that is the case. But sometimes it definitely does bias us towards quite inappropriate decisions. So we may well think, as the textbook points out, that the risk of dying in air travel is great because every second day you see some sort of plane disaster. But if you were to calculate how many little accidents with cars, you'd find that the chance of dying in a car, or probably even dying walking in the city, is greater than dying on a plane. But because plane accidents are talked about in the media and they're highly available and visual and they sink in, we tend to overrate that as a risk. So these kind of biases do affect our decision making. There's also a nice section there to do with escalation of commitment. I'll talk about that in a minute. Anchoring bias is another interesting one. Anchoring bias is about, if I say to you, what's the population of Yugoslavia, or I shouldn't say Yugoslavia, doesn't exist anymore, but Serbia, let's say. Is it more or less than 10 million? Your response will be heavily influenced by the fact I said 10 million. You'll anchor your decision around that level rather than other levels. Just check my phone. I won't answer that one. We're overly influenced by a figure that's put in our brain, and we anchor decisions around that. It's a good way to trick people if you're trying to get them to answer a wrong question. You use the anchoring bias. Confirmation bias is where we tend to pick up information that confirms a prejudice or a decision or a thought we already have had. So we're very good at selectively collecting evidence, and we're very biased in our perceptions of the world. These things are affected by a number of different aspects. For example, personality. Certain types of people are much more rush to judgment type of people. You can bias decisions by rewards, and there's a section in the textbook talking about the risks of, for stockbroking, for example, of having rewards related to things that may be very high risk or very low risk, and you will bias the decisions that stockbrokers make according to how the reward system's set up. Obviously, with time and policy constraints and mental overload, we tend to often make no decision at all, which is paralysis, or tend to make very foolish snap decisions. The textbooks also tend to point out, the research tends to demonstrate that women do tend to think about issues more. So having a mixed gender decision-making panel can sometimes be good, even though for men this can be very annoying because there'll be a lot of prevaricating between this decision and that decision. That simply causes us to stop and do a little bit of extra thinking, which can lead to better quality decisions. And then, of course, when we abandon all hope of rationality, we can get intuitive decision making. And the thing about intuition, it has a bad rap in the Western world. We tend to think of it as an emotional way to make decisions as opposed to lack of brains. So it's not a brainy way to make decisions, not a smart way to make decisions. But the business literature is littered with examples of terribly well thought out decisions that were still disastrous. And my own history as a business person contains a few unpleasant incidents where I put a lot of effort into a particular decision and still got it wrong. And I don't regard myself as being stupid. So sometimes going with signals that we pick up through the gut, just intuition, can be useful. Now, the thing that's worth pointing out about intuition, I'm hoping the slides will show that. I'll just go back. Is that I haven't got the slides quite structured in the right order, but the reality is that intuition, a little bit like creativity, which we'll be talking about shortly, can be enhanced by expertise. And this is what this issue of action scripts is talking about. If you're a very experienced manager and you've got all the basic stuff about management pretty well down pat, spelling error, by the way, then you can actually shift your brain out of this sort of base level of decision making up to a finer level where you can focus on these small signals that will inform your intuition. The reality is that if we're highly experienced, the decision making that we go through can be so rapid, that's these action scripts, that it sometimes can seem like intuition. The trouble is not all of us are very experienced at every decision type that we have to make, and not all of us are equally good at using intuition. So this is something that, as a manager, you need to be quite wary of as well. But the key message here is that intuition and creativity can be improved by expertise in a particular field. And I'll give further examples when we come to creativity in a minute. So improving decision making can be done by being aware of some of the risks related to decisions. So post-decisional justification, we tend to inflate the rightness of selected options and forget or downplay the options not taken. So this is a form of, it's also called post-decisional dissonance. So if we have two options of a direction in which to go, and they're quite close, the pain that we experience, the anxiety we experience before we make a final decision is quite distinct. But at the moment, those two options are very, very closely together right at the beginning. But once the decision is made, we've picked a Honda as opposed to a Toyota, for example, then suddenly we start collecting evidence from the newspapers, from the media, from looking at the street at the cars broken down next to the NRMA car. Oh, there's another Honda that's broken down. Gee, I'm glad I bought a Toyota. We start collecting information to inflate the rightness of what we chose, the Toyota, and we tend to downplay. This is all about inflating and not inflating self-concept, and tends to produce overly optimistic halo effects of positive decisions. Gee, I'm a good decision maker. I really have made the right decision. So be wary of that one. Escalation of commitment. I touched on that before, but I'll just talk a little bit further about this. Vietnam is a great example of this. The war lasted for many years, as the Afghanistan war has lasted for many years now. And there is a degree to which once you commit certain resources, soldiers' lives, tanks, dollars, budget deficits towards a particular outcome, you reach a point where you're no longer thinking straight about the decision. You are beginning to, you've invested too much into it, and you start looking back and seeing all all that you've invested in it and not being able to make rational decisions about when to quit. Your level of commitment has escalated to an almost unquittable position. So improving decision making. You need to evaluate the decisions you've made more effectively. And also, instead of using the group to validate your opinion, so if you've got a board of directors, instead of trying to get them all on board, actually encourage the breakup of decision making. Encourage people, perhaps through confidential feedback rather than group feedback, to give a more honest evaluation. With the relation to the escalation of commitment we just talked about, preset a trigger point at which you will abandon the project. Once we've spent $1 million, we're not spending any more. If it hasn't worked after the spending of $1 million, we pull out. And make sure you get honest, systematic and clear feedback. And that's often, honest is often anonymous feedback from staff or team members. Excuse me. So creativity, won't talk about it hugely, but within the business setting, creativity involves not just novel but also practical solution to problems. Divergent thinking is the ability to generate, to generate, not degenerate, unique approaches to problems, diverge different solutions rather than just always the same solution. It's got to be a non-trivial idea, as opposed to the example I used in class as a pink iPhone as opposed to a silver iPhone. I mean, that's change, but it's not, and it's novelty, but it wouldn't be called creativity. Now, I did talk a little bit before about intuition, and I'm going to use this example again here. So creativity sort of is, we like to think of creativity as a sort of, the artist in the garret, the painter, the inventor working in his little workshop, or the dreamer who suddenly gets this light bulb moment when sitting on a train about a great invention, or it comes to them in a dream. This area we're referring to is the actual core sort of personality skill, of creativity, the kind of individual difference that may mean more creativity or less creativity. But that can be combined with expertise. And by that I mean, for example, an artist isn't maybe born with skills, but they still need to develop a kind of base level, and beyond the base, higher levels of expertise. And the more expert they get, the more they can realize the creative skills. And secondly, it allows them to, as a painter, for example, at first you have to focus on being able to even create the colour you want to make. And so you've got that hurdle to get over, mixing the colours in the palette. And then moving up to the level of how to create these certain brush strokes before you can even start to express a vision. But the great thing, once you become expert at something, is that you can then start to focus on the just pure vision. The execution of the vision is, you've got that down pat, but you can begin to focus on this higher level of creativity. In relation to task motivation, I mean, we've talked about this before, but if you do not have any level of get up and go, do not have any level of arousal, motivation, or drive, that you can have all the skills and expertise in the world, but it will not produce output of creativity. So that's the 3-component model. Okay, so we often refer to these moments as light bulb moments, generated from fringe awareness, from semi-consciousness, which often follows this period of incubation, a period of letting it sit there in the background, having a sleep on it, thinking about it, have a few weeks to digest it. That kind of language is often used. This verification process, of course, is part that I would think is particularly important in a business setting, where you actually evaluate the value of a project and the likelihood of success, etc. But some of the characteristics that are associated with creativity is openness and a relatively low need for affiliation, so independent sole operators, people who don't need to have approval, people who do have a relatively strong self-stimulation and self-direction tend to be more creative. The ability, of course, to synthesize lots of information and inputs and analyze and assess and create useful ideas. That's the second area. Driven people, motivated people, people with high self-esteem who want to maintain that self-esteem, optimistic people, they tend to have more ability to let their brain free and loose. It produces the kind of driven, focused characteristics needed to produce creativity. And then we've got this business to do with the expertise. And again, this flexibility related to not having a fixed mindset in particular in relation to a particular problem. So those are some of the clusters of areas that are associated with creativity. And then there's the more practical stuff the textbook talks about. So if you've got an environment, an organisation in which you've got creative people, the way that you can improve their creativity is to encourage learning orientation so that you keep on learning, you know, training and courses and time to spend learning. Encouragement of risk. This is a key one. Creativity involves a lot of mistakes. It involves a lot of dead ends and billabongs where you goes nowhere. And you need to allow in the organisational environment this kind of mistake and error and false hopes to happen, because if you suppress risk-taking, you'll most certainly suppress creativity. And people will be less likely to come up with something creative next time for fear. Now, some of the other things we want to talk about here, intrinsic motivation. You don't, there's a great video which I think I was intending to show you, talking about how creativity, by adding incentives or bonuses to the situation, can actually reduce the likelihood of creative decisions being made. Having good quality open communications associated, having that security of job and support, they're all related to willingness to take risk. These three characteristics all related to that risk-taking ability, which is so closely associated. Having resources. It's clear that there's a reference in the textbook to Atlassian, the software producer, that has told its software designers that they can spend 20% of their week, which in other words is a day a week, working on whatever software project they like. And that obviously does that taps into intrinsic motivation. People's willingness to do things that they're intrinsically motivated is much greater than stuff that as we've been talking about for a number of weeks, than the stuff that's rewarded within the organisation. So what I'm saying here is that organisations that have a bit of fat in them, in the budget, obviously have the ability to foster creativity in ways that tighter units with less profitability or less resources are not able to do. The textbook refers to Clive Palmer, who's a fair bit in the news. Now Clive, it refers to a project of Clive's to do with the nickel project in northern Queensland. And it talks about the value that Clive brought to the company by encouraging employee involvement. The point I want to say was that the textbook makes a great little case there, but like a lot of things about decision making and creativity, one of the disappointing things is that company is now no longer doing nearly so well. So there was a short-term boost in productivity and success at the nickel project, but a longer-term problem. But employee involvement generally is a good thing, as you probably can guess from the discussion we just had about creativity. It's the degree to which employees can impact on the way. It's related to the degree to which employees can impact on the way their work is carried out. It relates to individuals' ability to consult, to make decisions, have some autonomy in decisions, to be well informed, and to, it effectively relates to the ability for teams to carry out independent action within the organisation. employee involvement tends to be more valuable and have more greater impact when a problem is new and complex, and so this may actually fade with time. I've often talked in this course so far about the difference between complex activities and simple activities, and the point that needs to be made here again is that if you've got staff making very simple widgets, to use the expression, very simple little components of something, and it just involves very boring, repetitive activity, a lot of the interventions we talk about in OB are not particularly useful except reward, piecework reward. So that's why, you know, you can have these great introduction of great measures within an organisation that have relatively little impact in these relatively low-level tasks. Involvement's also valuable where employees have knowledge and the bosses don't. And the reason why this is the case is because if you can foster a sense of involvement in your little work teams out far away from head office, you can, as a result, get all that local knowledge and get that feeding up through the systems. Bosses actually don't know everything about what's going on. Employees often know much more about little details. They don't have the big picture that you do have, but they have this fine detail of knowledge. And you, by having them involved, you're more likely to find out about it. It also tends to lead to greater commitment, of course, the final point is relatively obvious. So employee involvement tends to lead to greater outcomes, as in the Clive Palmer case, but it is contingent upon a number of different variables. And contingencies are those moderating or mediating factors between A and B that decide whether a decision has impact or not. And I have spelt source embarrassingly wrongly there. And I think that will do for this week. The assignment is coming up, the major assignment. If you have any major concerns, the outline that's provided in the assessment, the horizontal assessment block on Moodle, is quite useful. I got the page number slightly wrong, so make sure you actually focus on the case study that's actually named in the assessment item, and you'll get it right. And any questions, just email me or even have a go at phoning me. I generally am at my desk, except when I'm recording, in which case I go to this recording booth that you see in the background here. So all the best, and next week is a break, and I'm sure being a postgraduate student, that means absolutely nothing for you, and you'll be powering on with your studies just as before, and I certainly hope that's true. However, I will be taking a short break and focusing on getting some feedback to all of you on the postings you've done on the forum. This is for the Flex students, and generally focusing on getting my assessment systems up and running so that I can try and get feedback to you as quickly as possible in future. So thanks very much. Bye.